Hi, I'm Tim Shanahan, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago. One issue that has sort of been with us over the last decade is something that most people know as response to instruction or response to intervention, RTI, and these days in a lot of states people are talking about it as multi-tiered support systems or MTSS. We're really talking about the same thing in either case. Essentially, the idea was in 2005 when the federal government passed the most recent version of IDEA, which is the legislation that supports special education. They were concerned, the Congress was concerned about a number of things. They were concerned about the fact that special education populations for learning disabilities were growing and growing and growing, really at rates beyond what anyone believes learning disability is in the population. So that's problematic, both in terms of maybe putting kids where they don't belong, but also in terms of the dollars. And so that was a big concern. There was a substantial body of research that various folks had analyzed, including the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, that was finding that our methods for identifying who was learning disabled weren't actually working. Typically at that time, what most places did is they used what was called a discrepancy model. The idea would be that anybody who has average intelligence should be able to learn to read, and then therefore they would test kids. If they had average intelligence and were struggling with reading, then they must be learning disabled. Of course, if they were lower in IQ or measured lower in IQ, then they couldn't be learning disabled. The kids that were being identified weren't really any different than anybody else in terms of their reading ability. Nobody could find anything that was systematic or consistent there. So lots of problems for it. And so they adopted, or they actually increased something that was in the law at a very small extent, this notion of response to instruction. And they started to adopt a very different notion, and that notion would be that instead of just moving kids to special education, what if you move them to additional, better, more intensive instruction to see if they respond to it, response to instruction or response to intervention. If the student learned from such teaching, then they probably weren't learning disabled, they just needed that more intense support, and therefore you wouldn't move them to special education and so on. And it's kind of a nice idea, but what school districts did is what they were allowed to do under the law is they could use 15% of their money for, well, essentially trying to prevent special education placements, improving the quality of classroom instruction for those boys and girls, making sure there were interventions available for them that might correct their problem or allow them to get back on track, assessments that would monitor their progress to make sure that they weren't slipping through the cracks. And then, of course, for kids who didn't do well under that, who still were struggling, you could still make the kinds of special education placements that you did before. And it's a wonderful idea, because the idea of it is that you're trying to raise achievement for everybody. You're focused on the kids' needs rather than just some kind of a phony definition, and makes great sense. In December, the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Education, issued the first large-scale study of certain parts of response to intervention programs. And what they found was that, in fact, overall, it wasn't working very well. In fact, to be even more specific, what they did is they took those boys and girls who were struggling in reading and who were identified in grades 1 through 3 for extra reading help. They were going to be in one of these research-based interventions. And they were going to be monitored. They'd be tested and retested throughout the year to make sure that they were staying on track. They compare those kids with similar kids who aren't getting the interventions. What they found was, for first graders, the kids who were getting the intervention programs, who were getting the special teaching, actually did less well than the kids who weren't getting it. In other words, the intervention was holding the kids back, was keeping them from gaining in reading, like the kids who were just kept in the classroom. At grades 2 and 3, it wasn't a negative effect like that, but there was no positive effect. It didn't seem to make much difference. And so the reason why people are interested in that, of course, is that more than 80% of special education programs in the United States now have these multi-tiered support systems, or these response to instruction and intervention models, and if they're not working at such a large number of schools that they've just identified across the country, how does one think they're doing at your school? And so it's the reason why I'm talking about that here is really to revisit the idea, to let's take a look. The study itself couldn't tell you much more than it wasn't working, but it couldn't tell you why it wasn't working. And if you talk to the researchers who did the study, they'll tell you that all kinds of things that they suspect, but they don't have the data. I don't think people in the schools can afford to wait. I think if you know that this is a systematic problem and a widespread problem, it's probably a good time to take another really good hard look at your program. And so my talk today is going to take teachers and principals and so on through really a kind of a laundry list of the kinds of things that actually make a difference in achievement. That instead of maybe 3-tiered models, which is how people thought about it, you get classroom instruction, you get an intervention, and then you get special education if those aren't working. Somewhat whimsically, I'm proposing a 9-tier model. I don't expect anybody to use a 9-tier model. My point is that there are more than a couple of things we can do to try to raise kids' reading achievement, and we ought to, when we see kids who are struggling, we ought to put all of them into place, not just a couple of bureaucratic ones that we've agreed to do with our funders. We actually have to do something crazy, like try to teach boys and girls to read, and that's a full tilt boogie, everything you've got, perhaps ordered in the way that multi-tiered programs are, where the more intensive things come later, but from the very beginning, better classroom instruction, better instruction within the classroom for these strugglers, better interventions, better use of time, better involvement of parents, and so on and so forth. And so that's really what I see the issue as, is how do you de-bureaucratize your RTI program and make it serve boys and girls?